Delilah, can you hear me? Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to EDL 740, the week 5 Zoom session. And welcome back to some of you I haven't seen in a week or two. As a reminder to you all, the chat box is open, and you please feel free to put questions over there, and I will get to those, I promise, at some point in time during the course of the evening. You've probably figured out that I'm not very good on TV, and that's my apologies for that. It's just not my comfort zone, really. But I'd love to spend most of our time me answering your questions, but I will make a few comments at the beginning. It's not lecture notes, so you really don't have to take notes. I don't even pretend to be the smartest guy in the room. A reminder for you all that week 7, we will not have a Zoom session, but you'll have a final exam instead. You've already seen all the questions on the final, so that shouldn't come as a surprise to you. I hope that you're already in the process of putting your final exam together. You may have noticed this week that I opened the week 5 module on Sunday morning. I will do that again for you this next week on week 6, and then in week 7 I'll even open the module earlier than that, because you'll have a shorter deadline on week 7. You'll have to turn in all your stuff by the end of the day on Saturday instead of Sunday that week. I know how most of you have full-time jobs, and many of you have families and other kinds of obligations. I know you're swamped. I have not forgotten what graduate school is like. That's one of the reasons, however, that I structure the courses like the way I do, so that it's highly structured, and they look exactly the same from week to week to week, so that you can budget your time accordingly. And I hope that it's helpful to you in the process. But I have not forgotten what graduate school is like. I learned a lot about sleep deprivation when I was in graduate school, particularly working on the doctorate cricket. I think I spent more time reading things that were immensely uninteresting during that process, but it was good for me. In the process of this course, I told you from the very beginning that I wanted to help you become astute research consumers. Most of you work in the public school setting, and you deal with the high stakes accountability stuff every day. And as painful as that is, it has driven many of us in the field to become better at understanding and appreciating, in fact, the quantitative side of research, because when you're looking at test scores and demographics and all that stuff, it's pretty much quantitative driven. During the process of this course, I get the sense from reading your responses and stuff that some of you are beginning to develop a greater appreciation for the qualitative side of research. And I'm glad to see that. I believe personally that wise school leaders understand both, can use both, and they do use both in the process of trying to lead effectively the schools that they're in charge of. In the discussion prompt that I've titled Tool Choosing, if you were paying attention to your classmates' responses in that discussion forum, you can learn a lot from your classmates about tightening up your research questions. There's some really insightful comments among those responses, and about astutely choosing the tools that you'll need to inform those questions. It's pretty tricky to decide on, once you decide what your question is going to be and you feel like you've got it tight enough, then trying to decide on the tools that will help you collect data that's meaningful and will actually be helpful in helping you inform that question. Doability is always a huge issue. It's one thing to ask yourself, will this work? But it's another thing completely to ask yourself, can I actually pull it off? And a study that you can't pull off logistically really will do you no good, and it will not inform our profession either. So being able to zero in on something that you can actually pull off is a pretty big deal, and not as easy as it sounds. In relation to the discussion forums, some of you are also getting some interesting information and insight into various instructional tools and programs such as IXL, PBIS, and DIBBLES, and quite a few other kinds of programs and formats, models, if you will. If you see something posted by a classmate that piques your interest, seize the moment and ask them about it publicly, because if you have the question, it's most likely that other students in the class have the question as well. So as you know, on the discussion forums, I don't require you often to react to one another. I ask you to take a look in the collective learnings, but I don't demand that you go back and forth with each other. I'm always hopeful that you will, because I think there's a lot of learning that can be done in that. In the Professor John Schultz video regarding the research paradigms, that seems to have thrown some of you for a little bit of a loop. I love his hairdo, by the way. And then the Nurse Killam video or presentation dropped some vocab on you as well that many of you indicated that you were not familiar with. I mentioned this to you in one of the earlier Zoom sessions, the two words ontological and epistemological. The way I think of ontological is ways of being. It's the way we understand how we're situated within the cosmos, if you will. To quote the American philosopher Ken Wilber. And then the word epistemological, I think the layman's definition that I use for that is ways of knowing. It's how you and I come to understand and perceive how we know. And one of the presenters or the documents that you read indicated that epistemology is the relationship of the researcher to the research. But I like to think of it in a little broader sense than that, beyond the world of research, and basically ways of knowing. Killam also pitched at you realism and relativism. Is it black? Is it white? Is it gray? And I'm sure that some of this is, particularly the qualitative kind of language, vocabulary, is pushing some of you out of your comfort zones. Being an old math teacher myself, I used to, when I took personality typologies over the years, some of you have done the true colors thing, I guess, probably. And I've done the Gregoric, and I've done the Myers-Briggs and all those. Back in my younger days, and certainly before I became a school administrator, I would probably have to describe myself as anal retentive. I was very black and white in the way I viewed the world and the way I tried to operate. Being a school leader and in the world of school administration has certainly turned me grayer and grayer and grayer over the years, not just the grayness in the hair. That's one of the reasons I cut it all off, so you won't know how gray I actually am. But dealing with the complex problems that you have to deal with in school leadership certainly broadened my perspective and in the way I deal with things, and most importantly in the way I perceive problems and try to garner evidence and data when trying to craft solutions with people for problems. But one of the coolest analogies I think I've ever heard in relation to the realism versus relativism is if you take a look in that room, wherever you are, and take a look at a chair and you ask yourself, is the chair moving? Well, on the surface, it appears no. The chair is just sitting there. In the reality though, the chair is on this planet that's spinning around at about 1,000 miles per hour. So the chair in one sense is going like this at a speed of 1,000 miles an hour. In another sense, the chair is on this planet that's hurtling through space, and we're orbiting around the sun at the speed of about 67,000 miles per hour. So we're running this way at 67,000 miles an hour and this way at 1,000 miles an hour. And our solar system itself is moving through the universe at about 515,000 miles per hour. So when you take a look at that chair and you ask yourself, is it still? Is it sitting still? No, it's going at warp speed, but it's all about our perception. And in the terms of the qualitative researchers, or if you will, in the psychology world, we call it the subjective experience. It appears that it's sitting still. There's very dense vocabulary related to the quantitative and qualitative research. You're not getting the full dose of that, but I know you're getting a lot of words like assumptions and context and semantics, variability, interpretation, lenses, positivism, post-positivism, modernism, the whole thing, verisimilitude. If nothing else, you're going to be able to pitch a lot of multi-syllable words at your next job interview, and you can maybe win people over that way. But the parade of validities is one of the things that you're getting exposed to as well. You may only see some of these words in this course, but that's fine. You need to experience them at some point in your life, one way or the other. It's good learning nonetheless. Learning to discern good evidence from weak evidence or outright crap is one of the goals of the course, in my estimation, is I want you to become much better at taking a look at these studies that you're turning up and learning tasks 4 and 5. I think you're getting a much better feel for understanding how real studies are structured, and I can almost hear the profanity coming from some of you when I ding you for your APA citation, or I tell you this was a blog space, it really wasn't a study. And as I mentioned to you last week, in weeks 1 and 2, I offered to allow you to bump your grade back up if you wanted to redo some of the assignments. Those prompts are not coming from me anymore, but if you get a grade on assignment that you don't think is the one you want to live with, if you'll ping me, I'll certainly give you the opportunity to redo it. Making mistakes is one of the best ways we learn, and I don't ever want to be guilty of being one of those teachers that's not willing to let folks improve their work. Learning in relation to the quantitative research, many of you work in schools in which data analysis and data talks are part of your daily life. In fact, those are quantitative studies in a loose sort of way. And most of you are getting in the situations where you get pretty good at analyzing those numbers and then crafting some sort of action steps in response to them around the predefined objectives that you had, whatever those were. But please remember that those data are in no way complete explanations of those children. Those data are numbers that are relevant to only a very narrow, specific and narrow element within that whole child. And one of the problems we find, particularly in quantitative research, and I'll use the world of pharmacology and medical research in specific to make this point. Much of the research done in those fields it's scientific research. It's not quasi-experimental. It is experimental research. But they try to isolate a specific independent variable and see its impact on a dependent variable. And they can get some pretty significant results, but it is absent of consideration of the entire thing. For instance, if in the world of pharma, they may be experimenting with a particular drug that's designed to have a particular effect. Let's say the drug is designed to lower your blood pressure. And so they can come up with some drugs that will actually lower your blood pressure, but the side effects, and that's always the little bitty font print, on the back side of the label. Is it okay to reduce your blood pressure if the downstream effect of that is also that you hasten dementia, you become sweating profusely all the time, and it causes severe mood swings? you have to weigh the evidence against what's happening with the whole being instead of just that independent and that dependent variable. McCrindle, in the McCrindle presentation or content, she suggested that the bias of the researcher is usually detectable in qualitative studies, but not so in quantitative studies. And I want to take issue with that assertion a little bit. Even quantitative researchers can and often do tip their hand by the way they craft the response questions on their surveys. So it takes some real due diligence on the part of a researcher if they're trying to conduct a study with fidelity, to create and use a tool that is highly objective in the data collection, if that's your goal. If you're going in with some preconceived notion about how you want the results, that's a different deal. Josiah made the point that schools and school leaders are often awash in data, and absolutely that's true. In fact, I teach the use of data course from time to time here, and we talk about that extensively. But the trick is making sense of the data once we've collected it. And what you're learning to do, both in the qualitative, you're learning some stuff about coding and categorizing. In the quant as well, in some ways, in both of those, what we're trying to do is we take the data we've collected and we're trying to make some sort of sense out of it. And that's the trick, always, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. In the tool choosing prompt also, Mary mentioned, and I want to thank you, Mary, for sharing with us your personal grappling with refining your research question and deciding on the appropriate tools to pursue it. The question and the tools are inextricably intertwined with one another. The process is a complex dance between the two, and Mary's comments underscore that difficulty. Thank you for sharing that with us so openly, by the way, Mary. A couple of words that come up quite often when we are discussing research is correlation and causation. That just because there's a high correlation between two variables doesn't necessarily mean that one caused the other. If you look at the data from the centers, for instance, the Centers of Disease Control, the data are clear that if there is a very high correlation between obesity rates and type 2 diabetes and folks that live in states on the Gulf Coast Well, that's a correlation. That's a correlation, not a causation. If it were a causation, then the easiest response would be move north, or move west. But obviously, even though there's a high correlation between those things and the geography of being in the deep south, obviously just the geography is not what is driving those obesity and type 2 diabetes rates in those areas. Teresa noted that crises are going to happen, particularly for those of you in the EDL program. I frequently say, I've been teaching graduate school to people that want to be principals for about 15 years now, and I frequently say to those classes, you can hope that crap's not going to happen to you, but it is. And it doesn't matter whether it's inappropriate relationship between teachers and students, or it's going to be buses breaking down on the side of the road, or it's going to be teachers letting students leave class to go down to the convenience store for a soda pop. That stuff is going to happen to you. Some of it is truly crisis-like in nature. Some of it's just annoying inconveniences, but it's going to happen. And in the worst of those scenarios, and this cuts, many of you have pinged on the issue of school safety in your responses, and never has it been more important for those of us that work in schools to be highly aware and have good plans in place in relation to crisis. Excuse me. I remember a few years ago, I was the superintendent of a school district out in Texas when the Sandy Hook school shooting occurred. And that event triggered some real soul searching across the nation by school districts all across the nation about their situational awareness and their response preparedness should that kind of crisis occur. In that district I was superintendent of, we went through the same sort of conversations as well. And we decided that we needed to craft better types of response systems should something like that occur. That particular district was a rural district, and for some of you, this will probably be kind of hard for you to conceive of, but that district covered 900 square miles. It was basically an entire county, but it was a sparsely populated district. So there was, in fact, in that particular county, it was the third least populated county in the whole United States of America. Think about that. The third least populated county in the whole United States of America. The number one least populated county was one down on the Rio Grande River of Texas, between Texas and Mexico. And oddly enough, the number two least populated county was a county in Hawaii. And I couldn't figure that out because, I mean, I've always thought of Hawaii as being highly populated. So I'm just assuming, I don't know, that county must be the one that has the volcano sitting in it, but it may not be. I don't know. But I was working in the third least populated county, and we were having conversations about how to beef up our crisis response measures. And one of the interesting things, even though we were 900 square miles, there was only one full-time peace officer in that whole region. So one of the things that we were grappling with was how do we respond to some sort of catastrophic event when the likely response time of the only police officer in the county could be 30 minutes or longer. And this has been several years ago. We looked at the data, and at that time, I'm not sure what the current data is, but at that time, the data indicated to us that in those school shooting events, it was over in 7 minutes. So we were faced with how are we going to grapple with that? As it turned out, our school board in that school district was very much in favor of us adopting a policy in which we armed some of the staff to be first responders in case of that sort of catastrophic kind of occurrence. So then it was left to the superintendent to try to craft the language and put the program together to create the systems that were necessary, the approval processes for which employees would be allowed to bear arms, to put in place the periodic trainings that would be necessary for that process. That's a homework assignment that I didn't really ask for, by the way. But it's one that I got. And so those of you that end up being superintendents at some point in time, one of the things that you will hear, and it is the truth, is when you serve a school district as a superintendent, you have to remember that it's their children, their school, and their money. And it's your job to carry out the wishes of the school board, either that or move on. But in any event, in that particular district, we began putting in place those measures. And I received a phone call from a journalist from the Associated Press shortly after that. We were one of the first school districts in the nation, by the way, to adopt arming some of the staff policies. And I received a phone call from the Associated Press journalist, and it was a gentleman, and he was somewhat condescending, as if that we had come to our decision by simply thumping a spinner on the wall or something. I don't know how he believed that we had come to the decisions that we had come to, but we had looked very carefully at the data, and we'd done a very careful risk assessment of our own situation, and we'd thought very deeply and carefully about what risk we were willing to live with and which ones we weren't, and we came up with a plan. And one of them, I remember making the comment to him in that process, that as when we looked at what he and his colleagues had written about Sandy Hook, I said, from what you all have reported, it sounds like Sandy Hook had great infrastructure. It sounded like they had very robust plans in place. It sounded like they had practiced their crisis response regularly and with fidelity. And it appeared from what you all wrote that the adults in that building responded as well or better than you could expect from anybody. Several of them even gave their lives. And at the end of the day, they still lost 26 children. And I said, as we looked at that and what you all reported about that, it appeared to us that the one thing that Sandy Hook did not have was the ability to stop the shooter. And so that was the decision that our school board came to, that they wanted to make sure that at our school in that rural setting, that we were at least going to have the ability to try to stop the shooter inside of that 7 minutes. And when I was working with that school board, one of the things that I kept reminding them, and I kept reminding the faculty as well, that when those events happen, and there's no way to make it completely secure. The most secure environments that we have are prisons and military bases, and violence is a daily occurrence in prisons. Killings occur almost daily in prisons. Even the largest military base in the world is Fort Hood, actually here in Texas, and they had a shooting on Fort Hood. So even in those highly controlled environments, you cannot completely defend from all the possibilities of crisis. But what you can do is put the best systems in place that you can conceive. You can practice for that. But most important, and what's relevant to our coursework tonight, is this. Do your homework, do the literature review, study the data, and then make a plan of action accordingly. And so that's the point I was trying to make to you, is it's how important it is for you and I not to just look at surface data, but dig deeply on these things, particularly on these things that are so important, particularly the life and death kinds of things. Megan mentioned her campus, in a related topic, Megan mentioned that her campus went into lockdown for 6 hours last week. And I'm sorry, Megan, I have been there, and that is not fun. That is not fun at all. When you lock people down and hold them in a one room, everybody stays put for 6 hours at a time. You don't think about the challenges that follow along with that, but meals, restroom, just drinks of water, panic, all kinds of stuff associated with that when you go into lockdown. Many of you pinged on that issue of school safety, and it's just huge. The awareness and the preparedness and responsiveness is just, it's just, well, you know, it doesn't seem like we ought to have to do that as educators, but I guess in the current world we do. From your learning tasks 4 and 5 responses, it seems that you're getting a better feel for the type of data manipulations that go on both in the qualitative and quantitative realms to help you tease out that information, and that's by design. That's what this course is for. Now we're in week 5. We're moving into literature reviews. I think you'll find it a little less vocabulary dense. And I suspect most of you will enjoy the content this week probably more than you have in the 2 weeks that we specifically talked about the tools. But nevertheless, whether you do or you don't, you gotta go through it. As I'll do every week, I'll mention a couple of books that came to my mind as I was looking at your responses in all of the learning tasks and the discussion forums. One of the coolest books that I ever read, and it's chock full of data, But one of my, when I was working in a large high school as a principal in Austin, Texas, one of our science teachers asked me if I had ever read the works of a biologist out of Harvard named Stephen Jay Gould. And I said no. And so he passed the book on to me. The title of it was Full House, The Spread of Excellence from Plato to Darwin. I was never a science geek. Particularly, I didn't study deeply in the worlds of biology. But I found that book absolutely intriguing because Gould he's a scientist, professor at Harvard for years. By the way, that was a 96 copyright date. But one of the things that he did in that book that I had never experienced before was the way he used data to paint a picture of how species, not just humans, but how species in general have evolved over time and continue to evolve. And I had never been exposed to that kind of argument before, and I found it most intriguing. Another book that came to mind was a much more recent copyright, 2016, by a guy named Brett King out of the United Kingdom. And he's a futurist, I guess probably is the best way to describe him. But the title of the book is Augmented, Life in the Smart Lane. And a few of you have alluded to the concept of artificial intelligence in your responses. And so that's why the book came to my mind. King in that book talks at great length about how technology, and particularly the advent and the explosion of artificial intelligence, is changing almost every facet of our lives that we live in now. I think this will probably, in fact, Cricket's study is going to be centered largely around that facial recognition stuff, if I understand it correctly. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. And we are not going to get away from it. But I can highly recommend that book to you. Augmented, Life in the Smart Lane. It's time for me to answer a few questions. If you have them, I hope you do. Let me take a look at the chat box and see, can you speak to the format of the final exam? Still APA or general findings? Also ELC standards connections. So yeah, the final exam is going to be 3 parts. The first part, part 1, I'm just going to say, tell me the top 10 things you learned. We've been practicing on that a little bit in discussion forum. And it doesn't have to be necessarily a piece of content that I've shared with you or a learning task that I created for you. I mean, it's a valuable learning for you. Might have been something you learned from one of the other people in the class, or it might have be something that you dug up on your own. But what I'm trying to do in part 1 is give you the opportunity to tell me what you took out of the course that you felt like was reasonably valuable. So you get the top 10 learnings. And then the part 2 is I'm going to ask you to think about what you learned in the course and what learning task or learning event, it doesn't necessarily have to be a learning task, you felt most highly aligns with ELCC Standard 1, which is vision. And so, and then I'll ask you about Standard 2, which is student achievement, and I'll ask you about Standard 3 and Standard 4 and Standard 5. So I'm asking you to rethink retroactively back through all of what you've learned during that 7 weeks, and try to make some sort of solid connection with each of those 7 standards. And as I've told you before, I hammer away on that because I know you're going to be taking a credentialing exam, most of you, at some point in time, and all of those exams are tied to the national standards, either loosely or tightly. And then the third part, since this is graduate research, part 3 has to do with you articulating very clearly for me, and it'll be in a Google form as well, but I'm going to ask you your research question. I'm going to ask you the tools, whether it's qualitative or quantitative or mixed in nature. And I'm going to ask you specifically to tell us what tools you think you'll be using and what your sample set, how you're going to identify and recruit your sample set. It's going to be basically a research proposal. So if you were doing a study, either a master's degree thesis, or as in the case with Cricket, a dissertation, those are the kinds of elements that you would have to provide to your committee in order for them to give you approval to proceed with the study. Thanks for the question. Let me see here. Caitlin, I would argue as well that as far as quantitative data, having the survey be in English could potentially be an area of bias. Absolutely. Especially if the test is being given to folks whose second language is English. It's the same kind of issue. And the scores of those children are not only determined. True. And now, excellent point, Caitlin. It reminds me of one of the high schools that I served as a high school principal. I think I've told you all this. Our student population, the student population we were serving had represented 41 different home languages. And boy, we were diligent about everything, every communication that came from the school was in English and Spanish. And I kept saying to our folks at central office, hey, that means we got 39 other languages that those folks, they don't understand. Most of them don't understand fully what we're trying to communicate. As a campus principal, I was trying to create more effective communications methodologies, and as central office, and some of you experience this quite often, their primary objective is to protect the money. A conundrum for me, often. So Caitlin asked the question, what are your thoughts on that? If you're doing a study, you're actually studying children, which is hard, by the way. It's extremely hard to get approval to do research on children. Pretty hard to get approval to do research on any human subjects, and you've seen and read about the ethics issues involved with that. But it's particularly difficult to get studies approved directly with children. But yes, if you were going to be surveying or interviewing children, and not in their most common and comfortable language, then I think you would have to either get an interpreter, or if the children were old enough to read sufficiently, then you'd have to put in the survey items in their home language, or their most comfortable language. I took an Uber ride when I was in Shreveport last week, and the driver was a gentleman who was actually native to Pakistan. But he told me that his wife was raised in the Philippines. Neither one of them could speak the other one's native language, but when they got married, they communicated in English. And so I asked him when he got pissed off at her, if he started yelling at her in Pashtun, and he just laughed at me. He said, "Yeah, I do." But okay. Cricket makes note that you can see the cultural biases in some of the questions as well, particularly intelligence tests. Cricket, that brings another book to mind. And this, the copyright on this one, I think it would be in the mid-90s, 94, 95, 96, somewhere in that ballpark. And it made a huge splash nationally. And the title of the book was The Bell Curve, by a couple of professors, Charles Murray and I can't remember the other author. What they did was study exactly the thing that you're pointing out, is the inherent bias in the tests that we use, that we call intelligence tests, IQ tests. And the Stanford Binet and others, the Renzulli is almost always used in gifted, talented stuff. And they made the argument that as though the items are biased in such a way that it makes some races look more intelligent than other races. Well, those two authors just took a bloody beating in the media and in the public for being racist. And I kept hearing news reports about that, and I'm telling you, that book was like this thick. It was a monster. But I kept hearing the news reports about how racist those authors were. And I thought, you know, that it doesn't make sense that someone would write something like that to try to make money and take just a completely racist position. So I got the book and I read it. I think I got it from the Texas Tech Library, actually. And again, it was dense. But it seemed to me that the media was missing the point that the authors were trying to make when they were saying, we're measuring intelligence the wrong way. Because we're measuring it in a way that skewers the outcome for certain races versus other ones. And I remember having some interesting conversations, particularly with some of my colleagues at the University of Texas at Austin. In fact, one of them was the vice president of UT Austin. Now listen to that. One of the largest universities in this, UT Austin and Ohio State flip-flop is the largest universities in the nation. Both of them have about 50,000 students. And I was talking to the vice president about that book, and he was just railing on it. And so I said, hey, Doc, have you read the book? And he went, no, but I'm telling you what. And I said, hey, you didn't read the book. And he went, no, I don't need to read the book. And I'm thinking, you know, take a look at the book. Read it, see what it says. Because I think the authors really made a good point that they were castigating the tests that we use. They were not castigating particular races of people. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Good point though, Cricket. Thanks for raising that. Any other questions? In fact, I was having a conversation this afternoon with a superintendent, and we were talking about his school district. They need to redo their gifted talented plan, and he was asking me about recommendations for the kinds of thinking and the possibilities that they need to put into that. And we got off onto that particular topic of what tests do you use if you're trying to identify children for gifted and talented services, and those tests can be very biased. We know they can be biased in relation to cultural things. I mean, students in the city would be handicapped if you were asking particular kinds of questions in relation to what goes on out in the farms in the country, and students in the farms in the country would be under disadvantage if you were asking them questions about how to use the ticket taker in the subway system. So yeah, Aaron comments. I take it you've read the book. The problem was not the book itself, rather the fact that it was adopted by racists. Well, that's a good point. Yeah. No, you're not. It really. I was when I decided to read it. I wanted to see what if the depiction in the press was accurate for the book, and I felt like the authors really, the point they were making was we are putting several groups of people at huge disadvantage by the way we test for intelligence, because the tests are biased. It was kind of eye-opening for me to read the book. Other questions you got for me? Let's see. Theoretical framework. Lisa. The framework, theoretical framework. The theoretical framework, basically, the short version of that is when the authors of a study are relying on essentially the literature, a lit review around a certain well-respected and well-accepted concept. So an example of that, and since we're all educators, I'll use the works of Dr. Howard Gardner and his work on multiple intelligences. And he first came out with that theory of multiple intelligences in the vicinity of 1980 or in 1982, early 80s. In which he said, according to his theory, intelligence cannot be just thought of as one big whole thing. There's specific silos of intelligence that a person can be particularly highly intelligent in musical areas and almost retarded, for instance, in the area of spatial awareness. And so his point was that there are 8, and he's almost convinced himself from time to time that there's a 9th intelligence. But he believes that there's these different kinds of intelligence: linguistic intelligence, mathematical intelligence, spatial intelligence, naturalist intelligence. And I could name all 9 of them if you give me just a minute. But his point is this: we can't think of intelligence as just one construct. Well, he came out with that theory in the early 80s. It has been studied over and over and over. There is a large swath of professionals in our genre, educators in particular, but not limited to educators, that accept multiple intelligences theory as valid and reliable. So that would be the theoretical construct. Now, if you're reading a study, Lisa, that the authors of that study are trying to use multiple intelligence theory as the basis for as the theoretical framework, they will tell you probably in the abstract part, but if not, it'll be in the first few paragraphs of the actual write-up of the study. They're going to say the theoretical framework we used was that of multiple intelligence theory. And it doesn't matter which theoretical framework that authors, whatever they decide to use. If it's phenomenology, they're going to say, we hang our hat on phenomenology on this study. Or we hung our hat on feminist theory for this study. And what they're saying is, not only are we studying this concept, but we're relying on that whole body of work that's already been done in that particular area. So they're basically trying to bolster their argument by leveraging that entire well-accepted and highly regarded concept. That's not to say that everybody accepts multiple intelligence theory, because there are the contrarians, for sure. And there are with regard to feminism, and there are with regard to phenomenology, you name it. You're always going to find a group of folks that don't accept it, at least as well as it has been articulated. Caitlin, I always tend to think of this as, is there any theory the researchers, structure and frame? Yes. Yeah. But to cut to Lisa's question is this: if the authors don't, I mean, like a big flashing sign, declare the theoretical framework they're using, then they're probably not leaning on one. Should be pretty easy for you to pick out. You shouldn't have to dig and scratch for it at all. Thanks for the questions, by the way. It makes me feel better when I actually feel like I'm answering some questions for you. Now the clock's against us. I know y'all don't have anything else to do other than listen to old bald Professor yak. You know, I just learned last week, I didn't know this. I I learned last week that some professors require you to show up in the Zoom sessions every week. I mean, if not in live, they require you to review them. And I tell you at the front end, and whatever I say in this, you're accountable for knowing. It never occurred to me that I should try to put systems in place to force you to listen to me blather on. And I'm not sure that's a healthy thing for me to do, for you or me. Okay. Oh, well, thank you, Juana. Thank you back. Yeah. You know, I don't think I'm going to do. I don't think I'm going to go to that code thing unless somebody forces me to. I don't know. I don't know. I'll think about it. You know, I only want you to be here if you want to be. Okay, I'm about to run out of gas. If you got a question, you better fire quickly. I've said it before. I'll say it again. Thank you all very much. It's just really, truly an honor for me to have the opportunity to share in this journey with you. I'm glad you tolerate me. And I hope you'll come back next week. I will see you next Tuesday. By the way, I'm beaming to you from my ranch this week. I'm back home. Who knows where I'll be next week? We'll see. Have a good evening. Thanks for being here.